There's different theories. One is that there was a royal class of giant Native Americans. It's not just newspaper accounts. George Washington reported giant bones in Virginia. Even Abraham Lincoln talked about the discovery of giant bones.
My investigation began not with a legend, not with some overheated tale whispered on the late-night corners of the internet, but with a simple architectural oddity I could not explain away. I was documenting historic courthouses across the American Northeast for a preservation trust, a project that required me to photograph every molding, every baluster, every brass doorknob with the kind of exhaustive attention that drives most people to distraction but that I, by temperament, found soothing. I had been at it for 3 months when I noticed something strange in the back corridors of the Hampden County Courthouse in Springfield, Massachusetts. The door that led from the judge's robing room into the private hallway was 14 feet high. Not the grand ceremonial entrance where the public lines up to pass through a metal detector that I could understand as a statement of judicial majesty. This was an interior door, a utilitarian slab of oak hung on iron hinges, tucked away where no juror or spectator would ever see it. It was scaled so far beyond any functional human requirement that walking through it felt like stepping into a cathedral built for beings twice my size. I stood in that doorway, craning my neck, and felt the first cold prickle of a question I had never thought to ask. At first I filed the observation under Victorian bombast, the convenient label that historians use to dismiss anything in the 19th century that does not fit the tidy narrative of gradual, rational progress. The Victorians, we are told, loved excess. They built things too big because they could. A 14-foot door in a back hallway was just another example of that cultural impulse, a bit of architectural swagger that said nothing beyond "look what we can afford." I accepted that explanation for a week, and then I visited the county clerk's office in Albany, New York, and the explanation began to rot. The baseboards in that office were 20 inches high, the wainscoting scaled like a giant's dining room, and every single chair in the waiting area had a seat so far off the ground that my feet, when I sat, swung like a child's. I am not a short man. I stand just under 6 feet. In that room I felt like a doll propped on furniture made for a larger species. And still I told myself it was just decorative choice, just the way things were built in the 1880s, nothing to see here. Then I visited the state administrative building in Concord, New Hampshire, and the staircase nearly defeated me. The risers were a full 11 inches tall, every single one of them, for 3 flights. My thighs burned by the time I reached the second landing. I am a reasonably fit adult, and I had to stretch my hip flexors with every step, as if the staircase had been designed for a stride significantly longer than my natural gait. I measured the risers with a pocket tape. 11 inches. Standard modern risers are 7 inches. The difference is so dramatic that an average person climbing these stairs must physically alter their stride, reaching and pulling themselves up with the handrail. I stood on the landing, breathing hard, and for the first time I allowed myself to think the thought I had been pushing away: what if these buildings were not built for people like me? What if they were built for people substantially larger, and the whole official story about aesthetic grandeur was a retrospective justification led on by later occupants who did not understand what they had inherited? I sat on the top step, my back against the wall, and made a decision that would redirect the next 6 years of my life. I would measure every anomalous building I could find, and I would not stop until I had an answer. I found the photographs 3 months later, in the basement of a county historical society in western Pennsylvania that had lost its funding and was packing its collections into boxes for storage. The director, a tired woman in her 60s who smelled of old paper and coffee, gestured vaguely toward a stack of uncatalogued materials and said, "Take what you want. The rest goes to the incinerator on Friday." I spent the next day and a half sifting through that stack, pulling out tintypes and daguerreotypes of farm families, of wedding parties, of men in Union blue holding their rifles stiffly across their chests. It was patient, dusty work, the kind that numbs your fingers and clouds your lungs with the ochre dust of decaying emulsion. And then I pulled out a cabinet card that made me forget to breathe. It showed two men standing side by side in front of a brick building whose doorway was visible behind them. The man on the left was ordinary in every respect, a laborer's cap, a wool jacket, hands clasped in front of him, perhaps 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall. The man on the right was something else entirely. He stood a full 3 feet taller than his companion, his shoulders spanned. I turned the card over in my hands. The grain of the image was continuous across both figures. The lighting fell from the same angle, the shadows pooling at their feet in identical density and direction. If this were a composite photograph, a double exposure or a cut-and-paste darkroom trick, the technology to produce such a seamless forgery in the 1860s or 1870s simply did not exist. The earliest documented photomontages from that era are crude things, with visible seams and mismatched focus. This image was flawless. The man was real, and he had stood in front of that camera, and the photographer had not considered him a miracle or a monstrosity. He was just another client. That was the moment the bottom dropped out of everything I thought I understood about the 19th century. I began searching for more photographs with a focus that bordered on obsession. I travelled to archives in London, where the British Museum holds a bound volume titled Photographic Studies of Unusual Physiognomy, its spine crackling with age, its pages filled with 40 or 50 images of individuals who ranged from 8 to 10 feet in height, always posed formally, never sensationalized, often standing in front of buildings whose doorways suddenly looked perfectly proportioned to their frames. I visited the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, where a curator led me to a collection of carts to visit from the 1860s that included at least a dozen images of giant men and women in the formal attire of the Second Empire, their expressions calm, their postures dignified, their presence in the archive completely unexplained. I wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. and received, after months of bureaucratic delay, a terse reply acknowledging that they held several such images in a collection filed under medical anomalies, unclassified, but that the collection was not available for public viewing. I traveled to St. Petersburg and found references in the Imperial Russian archives to persons of unusual stature who had been employed in ceremonial and administrative roles, though the dossiers were conspicuously thin. Every archive told the same story. The photographs existed. They were catalogued, accessioned, assigned shelf marks, and then, with a quiet deliberateness, ignored. The pattern was maddeningly consistent across institutions, across nationalities, across more than a century of curatorial practice. Acknowledge that the thing exists, place it in a box labeled curiosity or anomaly or unverified, and then move on as though the box did not contain a question that could shatter the standard narrative of human history. Never ask why there were so many of them. Never ask why they appear in such a tight cluster between roughly 1850 and 1900. And never, under any circumstances, ask why they suddenly, completely, vanish from the visual record after the turn of the 20th century. The written record from the period provides a jarring counterpoint to the modern institutional silence. Diaries, letters, and small-town newspaper clippings from the middle and late 1800s describe giant individuals not as freaks but as functioning, respected members of society. A journal kept by a railway engineer in western Pennsylvania in 1878 describes a foreman of extraordinary physical proportion who could lift a rail tie that 3 men struggled with, and whose voice carried so far across the grading camp that no whistle was needed to signal the noon meal. A dispatch from a municipal building project in St. Petersburg notes that the overseer of unusual height inspected each course of stonework with an eye that missed no flaw, his head brushing the temporary wooden beams erected for the work. A county history published in Ohio in 1882 mentions, in passing, a tall guardian who stood watch at the door of the county records office, a man of such stature that a child could walk upright beneath his outstretched arm. In none of these accounts is the individual's size the point of the story. It is mentioned as an attribute, like the color of a horse or the make of a locomotive, a simple descriptive fact that required no drama. The occupational pattern in these accounts is too consistent to be random. The giants were rarely, if ever, described as merchants or artists or laborers tilling a field. They did not work in factories or keep shops or teach in schoolrooms. They concentrated overwhelmingly in roles of supervision, administration, and physical oversight. They were foremen on construction crews, guards at administrative buildings, overseers of public works, keepers of courthouse doors. They held positions that required a quiet, unarguable authority, the kind of authority that a 9-foot frame would convey without any need for a badge or a title. And here is the strangest detail of all: many of the written accounts and almost all of the photographs show these giant individuals standing in front of buildings. Massive buildings. Government buildings. Courthouses, administrative halls, records offices. Buildings whose doorways, in image after image, frame the giant in perfect, proportional comfort, the way a standard doorway frames a standard man. When I first noticed this alignment, I dismissed it as compositional chance. The photographer had chosen the doorway as a backdrop, and the apparent fit was a trick of perspective. But the more photographs I collected, the more the alignment persisted. Doorway after doorway, building after building, the giant stood in front of entrances that would dwarf any normal visitor, but that read, when the giant was in the frame, as simply the correct size. And that, of course, is when I went back to the buildings themselves with a new question in my head. I had been measuring doorways for months, documenting their anomalous heights and widths without understanding why they were anomalous. Now I had a hypothesis. The buildings were not built for bombs or grandeur. They were built for the people in the photographs. I began measuring again, but with a systematic intensity that far exceeded my earlier curiosity. I traveled to St. Petersburg and gained access to the General Staff Building, a sprawling administrative complex from the early 18th century that stands directly across from the Winter Palace. The public entrances are grand in a way that fits the official narrative of imperial display. But the internal corridors, the clerks' passages, the doors that connect the file rooms to the record halls, are a revelation. I measured interior doors that were 14 feet from sill to lintel, opening into rooms that are now filled with ordinary office cubicles, their original purpose completely obscured by a century of adaptive reuse. The baseboards in the older wings are 2 feet tall. The staircases have risers of 10 and 11 inches. The proportions are not consistent with any decorative school of the period. They are consistent with a physical scale that is not human in the ordinary sense. I flew to Buenos Aires and measured the municipal palace on the Plaza de Mayo. The grand public staircase, with its marble balustrades and its soaring frescoed ceiling, might arguably be explained as a statement of civic pride. But the back staircases, the ones that lead to the tax assessor's offices and the marriage license bureau, have the same 11-inch risers I had found in New Hampshire. The internal doors, hidden from any public view, are 12 feet high. The benches in the waiting areas, which are original to the 1880s construction, have seat heights of 30 inches. I sat on one and my feet dangled a full 6 inches above the floor. I am not a short man. In Delhi, I toured the colonial-era secretariat buildings that the British supposedly constructed for their own administrators. The desks in the clerks' offices, which are original to the 1890s, have writing surfaces 42 inches from the floor. A standard modern desk is 29 inches. A 6-foot man sitting at one of these desks would find the surface at his mid-chest, his arms raised to write as though he were a child at an adult table. The chairs that accompany the desks have seat heights of 33 inches. The guides and curators explain these proportions as Victorian design preferences, as if British civil servants in the India office preferred to conduct their paperwork in chairs they had to climb into like mountaineers. The explanation is, on its face, nonsensical. I pulled auction catalogues from Sotheby's and Christie's and dozens of smaller regional houses in New England, London, Berlin, and Moscow. The listings for oversized furniture are so common that they barely attract comment. A magnificent walnut armchair, possibly intended for ceremonial use, with a seat height of 32 inches, sold to a private collector in Connecticut. A pair of oak side chairs in the Gothic taste, of unusual scale, with seats 30 inches from the ground, purchased by a museum in Switzerland that labeled them as exhibition pieces. A mahogany desk chair, late Victorian, impractical for daily use, seat height 34 inches, bid up by two collectors who apparently found its impracticality charming. The auctioneers and the curators have agreed, without ever conferring, to a shared vocabulary of evasion. Decorative, ceremonial, display piece, theatrical. As if ordinary families in the 1800s routinely commissioned furniture they could not physically sit in, and distributed that furniture throughout the working offices of government buildings for purely aesthetic purposes. The buildings that contain these anomalies are not isolated curiosities scattered across a few eccentric municipalities. They number in the thousands. I have compiled a database of over 600 structures in 17 countries, all built between roughly 1700 and 1900, all featuring the same improbable proportions in their internal architecture. Courthouses in Springfield, Illinois, Des Moines, Iowa, Indianapolis, Indiana, Jefferson City, Missouri, and Lincoln, Nebraska. Administrative halls in Berlin, Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. Government complexes in Moscow, Kazan, Vladivostok, and Irkutsk. Colonial structures in Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, and Rangoon. Municipal palaces in Lima, Santiago, Bogotá, and Quito. The official explanation for all of them is the same: they were designed for aesthetic effect, to inspire or express the power of the state. But the official explanation does not account for the added cost, the enormous quantity of additional stone and wood and labor required to build a room twice as tall as it needed to be. It does not account for the heating bills in a Siberian winter, trying to keep a 40-foot-high records room warm. It does not account for the functional absurdity of installing chairs that no one can sit on in a space that is used every day by ordinary clerks. It only makes sense if the people who originally used those spaces were not ordinary clerks. And that is where the word Tartaria enters the investigation, and where the ground beneath my feet truly began to give way. If you consult any standard historical atlas today, you will not find Tartaria. The name does not appear in modern encyclopedias, except perhaps as a passing gloss on a medieval term for the lands of the Mongol Empire. But if you go back to the atlases and encyclopedias published before the 1840s, the word is everywhere. It is not a legend. It is not a vague cartographic fantasy. It is a clearly defined, politically labeled territory that stretches from the Crimea and the Caspian Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the mountain ranges of Central Asia and the Himalayas in the south. It appears in the atlases of Herman Moll, published in London in the early 1700s. It appears in the maps of the Blau family in Amsterdam. It is drawn with the same thick, confident lines as France or Spain on the maps of Guillaume de Lille in Paris. It is referenced in the official publications of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in Moscow. The 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica devotes several pages to it, describing its provinces, its principal cities, its form of government, and, significantly, its vast and regular structures of stone. The Tartaria described in these sources was not a loose collection of nomadic tribes. It was an organized political entity, with a central administrative apparatus, a coherent system of territorial governance, and a built environment of monumental scale. The sources are casual about this, matter of fact, as if describing the institutions of Tartaria was no more remarkable than describing the institutions of Prussia or of Portugal. And then, sometime between the 1840s and the 1880s, it vanishes. Not through a documented war, not through a treaty of annexation that you can trace in the diplomatic archives, but through a quiet, systematic process of cartographic and encyclopedic revision. The map publishers simply stopped printing the name. The encyclopedias, between one edition and the next, strike the entry. The history books, one after another, ceased to mention it. The word Tartaria is lifted out of the authoritative record as though it had never been there. But the architecture remains. Across Siberia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the vast reaches of the Russian Far East, there are buildings and ruins of buildings that conventional history cannot adequately explain. Star-shaped fortresses with walls of perfectly fitted granite, their geometry so precise that modern surveyors have commented on the accuracy of their layout. Administrative compounds with doorways scaled for giants, their foundations sunk deep into permafrost with a sophistication that implies engineering knowledge far beyond what the official narrative attributes to the nomadic societies of the region. Entire complexes whose architectural grammar, the proportions, the alignments, the decorative motifs, suggests a coherent, transcontinental design language, a single tradition of construction that spanned thousands of miles. We are told these structures were built by the Russian Empire or by various local rulers or by Cossack settlers. But the documentary record is a void. There are no architectural plans. No contracts. No payment receipts for the quarrying and transport of the stone. No contemporaneous accounts of their construction. The buildings exist, massive and inexplicable, and the historians have, by unspoken agreement, chosen not to dwell on them. What if the giants in the photographs were not random biological anomalies, not the products of a rare pituitary disorder that somehow afflicted dozens of people in a single century, but were instead a specialized administrative caste of the civilization that Tartaria represented? What if their size was functional, a product of selective breeding or deliberate biological management, designed to produce overseers physically capable of managing monumental construction projects? It would explain, in one stroke, why the photographs are always formal and official in character. It would explain why the written record places them in supervisory roles. It would explain why the architecture of governance, the courthouses, the administrative centers, the records offices, is scaled to their bodies, while the architecture of ordinary domestic life remains scaled to the average human frame. The giants were not the entire population of Tartaria. They were its officers, its guardians, its keepers of the built environment, a specialized class of physically exceptional individuals integrated into a world-spanning administrative order. And when that order was dismantled and erased from the historical record, the most visible, undeniable evidence of its existence, the giant administrators themselves, had to be erased as well. The photographic record is not the only evidence of their existence, and the buildings are not the only physical remnants. I need to speak now about the newspaper reports, because they constitute a body of evidence so dense and so geographically distributed that it cannot be dismissed by any honest observer. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, mainstream newspapers across the United States reported the discovery of giant human skeletons with a frequency and a matter-of-factness that is, in retrospect, astonishing. I am not talking about the lurid tabloids that flourished on the margins of the newspaper industry. I am talking about the sober, respectable, middle-class daily papers, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the San Diego Union, that formed the backbone of American public discourse. The skeletons they described ranged from 7 to 12 feet in length. They were found, often, in organized burial contexts, mounds, underground chambers, stone-lined graves that had clearly been deliberately constructed. They were frequently accompanied by artifacts of a sophistication that challenged the standard picture of pre-Columbian material culture, copper bracelets of refined metallurgy, flint blades of exquisite knapping, inscribed tablets of a script no one could read, remnants of woven fabrics that contained metallic threads. I have compiled a personal database of over 250 discrete newspaper reports of giant skeleton discoveries in the United States alone, spanning the decades from 1847 to 1919. A report from Michigan in 1885 describes a 7-foot 3-inch skeleton with a skull of remarkable thickness, found alongside copper implements of a design unfamiliar to the local antiquarians. A report from California in 1895 details bones of extraordinary size uncovered during a railroad grading operation, the femur measuring 23 inches in length, indicating a stature of not less than 8 feet. A report from Ohio in 1899 describes a skeleton measuring 8 feet 4 inches, the bones of the forearm alone exceeding the length of an ordinary man's entire arm, found in a stone chamber buried beneath 12 feet of soil. The Chicago Tribune, in 1903, ran a front-page story about the discovery of a prehistoric giant near Lake Delavan, Wisconsin, whose skeleton measured 9 feet in length and was found in a mound that also contained copper knives and arrowheads of a size too large to have been wielded by any known native tribe. The reports are not scattered across obscure county weeklies that no one has ever heard of. They appear in the flagship newspapers of the nation. The New York Times alone published more than a dozen such accounts between 1870 and 1910. At the time, the discoveries were considered newsworthy but not controversial. They were anthropological puzzles, pieces of a larger picture that the nation's scientific institutions were expected to assemble. Local physicians were often called to the site to measure the bones, to verify their proportions, to confirm that the skeletons did not show the pathological signs of gigantism, the distorted jaw, the enlarged hands, the thickened skull, that would have marked them as individuals suffering from acromegaly or pituitary adenoma. The physicians consistently reported that the skeletons were proportionate, normally articulated, and entirely unlike the remains of diseased individuals. And then, with a suddenness that is itself the most damning piece of evidence, the reports simply stop. Not gradually, as if archaeological fashion had shifted and interest had waned. Abruptly, around 1920, as if a switch had been thrown. The skeletons that had been front-page news one summer were never mentioned again. The discoveries that should have produced detailed monographs in the Smithsonian's annual reports produced only silence. When independent researchers began to look into the matter in the mid-20th century, writing letters to the Smithsonian Institution and to the various local museums that had supposedly received the remains, the replies they got were a litany of bureaucratic calamity. The skeletons had been lost during a warehouse reorganization. They had been destroyed in a fire that consumed the uncatalogued materials. They had been misplaced during a departmental transfer. They had, in at least 2 documented cases, been sent to a specialist for analysis whose name and address could no longer be located. The Smithsonian's current official position is that no such giant skeletons exist in its collections, that the newspaper reports were likely a combination of exaggeration and hoax, and that the few anomalous large bones it does hold are the result of pathological conditions in otherwise normal individuals. The sheer volume and internal consistency of the newspaper reports makes the hoax theory impossible to sustain. 250 separate reports, published in dozens of different newspapers in cities that were not in regular communication with one another, spanning 70 years, often involving named local physicians and specific anatomical measurements, this is not the profile of a hoax. A hoax is designed for sensation, for the quick profit of increased circulation. It does not persist across nearly a century. It does not involve local doctors and county surveyors and university antiquarians. It does not produce physical remains that are then shipped, at public expense, to the nation's capital. The newspaper reports are evidence, and the fact that academic historians have chosen to ignore them rather than explain them is, in itself, a phenomenon that requires explanation. The pattern that emerges when you lay the newspaper reports alongside the photographs, the architecture, and the cartographic record of Tartaria is so tight, so perfectly convergent, that coincidence becomes an impossible explanation. The giants appear in the visual and written record during the same decades that Tartaria is being systematically removed from the maps and encyclopedias. The giant skeletons are unearthed in the same decades, and the discoveries peak in frequency at the very moment when the last references to Tartaria are being struck from the authoritative texts. The architecture that is proportioned to the bodies of the giants dates from the same period. The oversized tools and furniture surface in the same geographic regions where the skeletons are found and where the Tartarian fortresses still stand. It is a quadruple convergence: photographic, archaeological, architectural, and cartographic, and to call it random is to abandon any coherent standard of evidence. I need now to tell you about the tools, because they represent a category of evidence that is, in one sense, the most ordinary and, in another sense, the most irreducibly physical of all. These are objects you can touch, heft, measure with a tape, inspect for wear marks. They do not rely on the interpretation of a photograph or the transcription of a newspaper article. They are hunks of forged steel and iron, and they exist in substantial numbers, scattered across the industrial archaeology of at least 4 continents. Across estate sales and demolition sites in western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and northern Indiana, massive wrenches have been turning up for as long as anyone can remember. Antique dealers in the region call them locomotive wrenches or factory wrenches and price them by the pound, displaying them as conversational curiosities for collectors who appreciate the quirkiness of 19th-century industry. But no locomotive ever required a wrench that measured 5 feet 7 inches long and weighed over 200 pounds. I have held one of these wrenches in the back room of an antique shop outside Pittsburgh, and it is an object that defies any industrial application I can imagine. The handle is so thick that my hands, which are not small, could barely close around it. The jaw mechanism still moves, the threads still engage, but the force required to turn the adjustment ring is beyond my unaided grip. The patina of the metal shows the characteristic wear of repeated use, the slight rounding at the points of maximum grip, the micro scratches that align with the direction of applied torque. This tool was not a decorative piece. It was not a sign for a blacksmith shop. It was used, over a long period, by hands that were enormously larger and more powerful than mine. The same category of evidence extends to hammers, chisels, and sledges found in quarries and mining sites across Siberia and Mongolia. Colossal stone-cutting hammers with ashwood handles 8 feet in length and iron heads weighing 90 pounds or more. The striking faces of these hammers show the characteristic mushrooming deformation of metal that has been repeatedly struck against hard stone under enormous force. A museum in Ulaanbaatar holds one of these hammers in its basement storage, labeled simply a mining tool, 19th century, with no further comment. A photographer I hired to document the piece stood beside it for scale. The hammer's handle reached from the floor to well above his head. To swing it, you would need to be at least 8 feet tall, and you would need the proportionate strength of that height. Given those conditions, the hammer would not be a superhuman burden. It would simply be a heavy sledge, no more unwieldy in the hands of its intended user than a 16-pound hammer in the hands of a modern construction worker. The physics scales with the frame. These tools are not vanishingly rare. In my travels through the antique districts of Moscow and Kazan, I found entire sections of warehouses devoted to oversized industrial artifacts, their provenance unknown, their purpose uncatalogued. Museums in Berlin, Vienna, and London hold specimens in their science and industry collections, usually displayed high on a wall where the public cannot gauge their scale against a human body. The accession cards list dates, materials, and the vague location of their discovery, but never the essential information: what sort of human being used this tool, in what sort of construction project, for what purpose. The curators whom I have pressed on this question develop a sudden, glassy blankness. They refer me to other curators, who refer me to storage rooms that are closed for renovation, to catalogues that are being digitized, to specialists who have recently retired and left no forwarding contact. The institutional avoidance of the question is so smooth, so practiced, that it must be either a conspiracy of extraordinary subtlety or an ingrained cultural reflex so deep that the individuals who practice it do not recognize what they are doing. I lean toward the latter explanation, though I am no longer certain. When I add the tools to the photographs, and the photographs to the architecture, and the architecture to the newspaper reports, and the newspaper reports to the cartographic erasure of the Tartaria, the conclusion that emerges is as stark as it is unsettling. A physically distinct class of human beings, larger, stronger, proportioned to a scale approximately 50% greater than the modern average, existed in significant numbers throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. They were integrated into the administrative structure of a world-spanning civilization whose name, in the cartographic record, was Tartaria. They served as overseers, foremen, and guardians of the built environment, and the buildings they constructed and inhabited were designed to their physical specifications. Around the middle of the 19th century, this civilization was dismantled, and its memory was systematically stripped from the historical record. The maps were redrawn. The encyclopedias were rewritten. The skeletons of the giants, when unearthed, were collected by central authorities and lost. The photographs were mislabeled and buried in archives. The buildings were repurposed by successor empires who claimed their construction as their own. And the entire framework of inquiry that might uncover this history was gently, persistently, terminally closed. I know how this sounds. I know the clinical term for the accusation I am making. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, and I have had that word thrown at me, with varying degrees of politeness, by every academic to whom I have tried to explain my research. But a conspiracy requires a small, secret group of individuals plotting in a room. What I am describing is something different. It is a systemic, decentralized, multi-generational process of narrative control, not orchestrated by any single cabal, but enforced by the shared assumptions and unacknowledged boundaries of an entire intellectual culture. The curators who file the giant photographs under unverified are not taking orders from a central bureau. They are acting on a deep, almost instinctive understanding that certain questions are not serious, that certain lines of evidence are not worth pursuing, that certain conclusions are, by definition, incorrect. The system polices itself, and it does so with such quiet efficiency that no formal censorship is required. The most painful moments in my research have been the encounters with smart, educated people who could not, or would not, see what was in front of them. I stood with a senior curator in a museum storage room in London, looking at a chair with a seat height of 35 inches, and asked him who he thought had sat in it. He smiled, a little sadly, as if I had asked a question that revealed my naivety, and said, "No one, my dear fellow." That is rather the point. It is a display piece, a fantasy of scale, never intended for actual use. The chair, which I had been permitted to examine, showed the unmistakable compression marks on its upholstery that come from years of bearing weight. The front of the seat was slightly polished from the friction of legs swinging against it. It had been used, often and for a long time, by someone whose legs reached the floor from a 35-inch seat. But the curator could not see that. His training had taught him that to see it was to make a category error, and so the evidence registered only as a curiosity, a footnote, a thing that did not signify. I have written letters to historians, to anthropologists, to the public affairs offices of major museums. When they bother to reply, the replies are always some variation of "this has been looked into before," and nothing came of it. But when I ask for the details of the previous investigations, the names of the researchers, the dates, the findings, the archive boxes where the investigations papers are stored, the trail goes cold. It turns out that the previous investigation was informal, was conducted by someone who has since died, was never written up, or was, in one particularly egregious deflection, conducted orally and not committed to paper for reasons of budgetary constraint. The history of the non-investigation of the giants is itself a kind of negative evidence, a shadow of the inquiry that should have been but never was. I do not claim to have a complete picture of what Tartaria was, how it functioned, or what precise historical process led to its dissolution and erasure. I am not a historian of the political structures of pre-modern Asia. I am a person who started with a laser measure and a notebook, documenting the heights of doorways, and followed the evidence wherever it led. What I have found, after years of measurement and travel and archival digging, is a body of material that cannot be explained within the boundaries of the standard historical narrative. The photographs are real and were taken in circumstances that their own contemporary descriptions treated as ordinary. The newspaper reports are real, and they describe discoveries that were documented in language of clinical precision by named physicians and county officials. The architecture is real, and it can be measured tomorrow morning by anyone who cares to walk into a 100-year-old courthouse with a tape measure. The tools are real, and their wear patterns indicate a kind of use that no modern industrial process requires. The cartographic record of Tartaria is real, and its erasure can be traced, edition by edition, across the atlases and encyclopedias of the 19th century. These are not beliefs. They are data. They are the kind of data that in any other field, geology, astronomy, forensic pathology, would be considered conclusive evidence of a phenomenon requiring explanation. The reason they are not so considered in the field of history is not that the data are weak but that the implications are strong. If the giants existed, if Tartaria existed, then the entire story that modern nation-states tell about their own origins is compromised. The Russian Empire did not civilize a wilderness, it reproposed the infrastructure of a prior civilization. The colonial powers of Europe did not build from scratch in Asia and South America, they occupied buildings that were already ancient, already scaled for a different kind of occupant. The United States did not inherit an empty continent, it paved over the ruins of a system